Hello, everyone. It's lovely to see all of you here today. I want to welcome you. I'm Giovanna Cesarani, Faculty Director of CESTA. And I just want to take a minute before we start to tell you that we have given a lot of thought whether to proceed with today's event, because we do not want to pretend that everything is business as usual today. At this moment of extreme pain, grief, righteous anger, and sadness. And I want to say that our being together today should not detract from the fact that we stand with communities of color right now, and especially with all members of the Black community who have suffered so long and suffered deeply now. And we decided in the end to be here together today, bringing our community in this virtual mode that we have been practicing now for a very long quarter like no other, and that it means a lot to us to be together today for the last event that we have scheduled for this quarter. But so now let me briefly introduce with great pleasures the speakers today, Rachel Midura and Evan Kim. So Rachel has long been an integral part of CESTA throughout her time at Stanford. And I speak about her time at Stanford because she will be leaving us this summer, and we are very sorry to see her go, as well as very happy for her new chapter in their academic life. But from her arrival here at Stanford in 2013, Rachel has worked so intensively, starting right away when she arrived, collaborating on two projects, faculty-led projects that she joined, the Galileo project with Paula Findlen and the Grand Tour project with me, which she has become a co-author and essential collaborator as we push further to the publication that we've been looking forward for so long. But Rachel then has been since relentlessly active in the CESTA community, teaching courses, taking workshops for her own development, and leading workshops in the development of others here at CESTA. And it's been really so crucial to the animating of CESTA that it's hard to think what we will be like without you. And we will be sure to bring you back together as soon as we can, because Rachel is also right now defended and finishing her thesis in the history department entitled Masters of the Post, Northern Italy and European Communication Networks, 1530 to 1730. And this is what she's been interested in since she arrived. What does information technology look like, and how in the early modern age, and how can digital tools bring new understanding to it? And it's on the strength of this work of hers that she also gained a new position, and she will be joining as an assistant professor of digital history, Virginia Tech in August, Tech and State University in August. And it's her work in digital humanities has already been published, and more will be published soon. And it's a very long CV of accomplishments, but it's greatly exciting to hear her today, just before she then goes in this summer on a new platform, exciting tool that she has been working and developing in the context of the wider project Early Modern Mobility. And when we say that digital humanities is collaborative, I think that Rachel's work is a testament to this. She has been collaborating with me and many others in tremendous ways, and also developing her own collaborations with other colleagues nationally and globally. And today, the other speaker is one of her collaborator, Evan Kim, who is a junior majoring in symbolic system with a minor in East Asian studies. And Evan is deeply interested in the intersection of technology and humanities and has been working as a research assistant since summer 2019, and in particular with Rachel to develop this new tool that they will talk to us about today. And I also want to mention that he participates in Stanford Chamber Music program as a cellist. So you might come across his name and his creativity in that context as well. But with no further ado, before taking more time, I want to hand it on to them. And the title of the talk today is The Traveler's Companion, International Currency and Mileage Conversion, 1550 to 1650. Thank you, and it's a real pleasure that you bring us today together, and we can't wait to listen to you.
Well, thank you, Giovanna, for that lovely introduction. And I'm sorry I had to jump up and boot the cat who was going to otherwise alert me that it was treat time. But I'm so glad to be joining all of you today. Yes, Giovanna and I talked briefly before the presentation, and I think this is ultimately an act of escapism right now, but I hope that it will be valuable to you. It certainly has been to me to be able to focus on something else for a little while. It's also meant a lot that I had this opportunity to say thank you one final time, perhaps, to CESTA and Stanford as a whole. My experience in the past 6 years has been almost universally positive. I certainly would not have been able to secure this position as a digital historian had it not been for the collaborative opportunities that CESTA has provided to me, and all of the many ways that Amanda and Giovanna and many others have supported this work. I also want to thank Evan, who will basically, I'll talk for about 20-25 minutes. I'll hand it over to Evan at the end, who will say a little bit about his role in this project. But I do want to go ahead and thank Evan and Elliot Miller as well, who worked earlier as a research assistant. And thanks to the Early Modern Mobility Project, which has provided the funding that made this kind of work possible. With that, I think I'll jump right in. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. Here we go. Can everyone see that okay? Great. We're going to hope that Google Slides cooperates with us today. Yes, so one other caveat for this project is that this is me dipping my toes into the world of economic history and early modern currencies in particular, which is a thorny forest indeed. That being said, my goal is to produce a tool that will be useful to historians like me who are not primarily economic historians, but are increasingly interested in dealing with transnational topics, and especially being able to do digital history with early modern sources, which often means needing to read quantitative information and really understand the quantities that are being discussed. So this project grows out of the work that I've presented a couple times in CESTA and other settings on early modern itinerary production. Itinerary books were these small books, and I provide an image here of the British 4 copies in the British Library. You can see that next to this £2 coin for scale. They're very small books. They were meant to be carried on the road in many cases. And I think that the marginalia often supports this as well, that you see travelers making, amending the text or even marking off specific journeys. So this is the main content of the itineraries, which are these route tables that provide information in how to travel from one location to another. So this really ties into my dissertation work, which has been on the way that the first European postal systems really come to define space, time, communication in the early modern period. What these books also often provide, however, are assorted other tools for travelers. And so this project is a bit of a spin-off in attempting to take that information and turn it into a usable tool. Yes, here's a little bit more overview about the itinerary database as it stands. So this, as far as I know, is the first real effort to create an international bibliography of itinerary book production. I've assembled about 72 itinerary editions that are published across Europe, across this period of about 1550 to 1750, very broadly defined. So this image on the right is showing you where those places of publication are, sized by the number of publications. And then down at the bottom, a timeline to show when these are from. So you can see it's actually, I think, it's an attempt at a comprehensive bibliography. I think many of these books probably don't survive to today, especially as they were ephemeral literature. They were carried on the road. That being said, I feel like I can say that this is a relatively representative sample, and it's allowed me to do some really interesting things. So about 10% of these books also feature tools for converting mileage, currency, and weight. Today, I'm going to be talking about the mileage first, which is a slightly easier conversion process. Then I'll be talking about currency. We haven't yet really delved into the weight set of issues, but that's kind of where I'll end on the to be continued note. So my first thought was to find some examples of digital tools that are out there because having relied upon a number of digital resources in the course of my dissertation, I thought surely someone has already thought to do this. The answer is that they have, but it's in slightly different forms. And there were ways that I wanted to build upon this work and approach it in a different way. So this first resource I found is the Medieval and Early Modern Data Bank, which I believe that both of the projects I'm about to show you actually predate these incarnations. I think these were originally designed as CDs. And I would love to hear from historians who maybe used these in the 90s or early 2000s. Certainly around the early 2000s, they migrated to a web format. They are not incredibly user-friendly. This resource in particular is extremely valuable. It's a transformation of secondary source literature into conversion tools. But in order to use it, you have to first choose a secondary source. They're not entirely comprehensive. Some of them are very specific. Some of them are too broad to be very helpful. And they're not user-friendly. So on the right, this is an example of how you have to go through. And in order to choose the unit, you have to go through an alphabetized list of all the units that are available. And they're divided. You can see they're into different sets. It's not entirely clear what the different sets are. You have to go to a different page to actually read the literature on what constitutes those sets. And then sometimes it's just, you'll choose 2 units and it will be unable to provide a conversion between those 2. And you just have no way of knowing that until you've already gone through this whole process. This tool I like a bit better. It's also, I think, a little more recently updated, the Pierre Marteau currency converter. For this, what you do is you initially start by choosing the region that you want, the 2 regions that you want to convert between. And then you get a second page, which actually provides you with your input region and your output region on either side. I think the design is quite nice. It's very clear, black and white, and it even provides you additional information about what those constituent conversions are. So while the previous tool had been mostly based on secondary scholarship, this one is also a transformation of a primary source, which is Georg Heinrich Paritius, Cambio Mercatorio, which is published in Regensburg in 1709. So this is a very useful tool. It's based on 1 book, and so it's somewhat limited in scope. They actually say that it's accurate for about 1690 to 1720. Which is a relatively limited time period. And in fact, what I've generally found is that among the other tools that are out there for currency conversion, they very rarely go before about 1680, 1690. They're much more likely to go 1700 forward. And this is because there's much more standardization at that point in time. And some exchange rates stay relatively stable well into the 20th century. There's other tools that provide for medieval currency exchange. They often go up to about 1300 or 1500. So you end up with kind of a weird gray zone, which is inconveniently exactly where I work, which is between about 1550 to 1650. It's not quite medieval, it's not quite modern. So I knew that my goals for this tool were going to be to address that period, to build upon the user interface and be slightly more navigable than some of these tools. And then also to really be based on primary sources. I wanted this, I don't mean for this to be a decades-long project. I mean for this to be a relatively self-contained project where I can say, these are the 10 or so primary sources that I'm using. And without getting into the weeds in some ways that I'll show you are certainly possible. So let's talk about mileage first. This one is actually interesting because I didn't find any mileage conversion tools out there. I think, and to provide you with a little bit of background, this is what it looks like in the itinerary books, is that typically it'll be just a little disclaimer at the beginning of the book that says, when you find this mileage, this is what it converts to. And these are two examples that you can see show how this itinerary genre has some pretty standard inclusions, even though it's being published in very different places and time periods. So we've got one on the left that's in Italian, that's published in Milan in 1550, and then one on the right that's published in German in Augsburg in 1625. So the metric system that we know today doesn't really come about until the 18th century. The first attempts at the metric system are pre-French Revolution. It doesn't really take hold until even later than that, until, you know, arguably the 1830s and beyond. In doing some secondary source reading on this, I found Witold Kutla says that there are 232 different feet across Europe in the period that we're talking about. And it's because a lot of this measurement is ultimately based on the human body. And has the variability that one would expect to see there. So trying to discover what the root of many of these systems is will take you back to the Roman system, in which there's 1,000 paces to a mile. Pretty straightforward. This gets a little more complicated once, you know, it's not quite that conversion rate for across Europe. In Italy, it remains more or less the same as the Roman system, but it gets different in other places. On top of that, we have the league. So the league is often represents the distance that could be walked in about an hour. And again, this varies a lot by region. And then in the period that I'm working on, we start to see the use of a post as a measure of distance. So one of the things that goes with the building of these postal way stations is a mandate that they be located a certain mileage apart. So you start to see travelers who are traveling by post referring to places as being 5 posts to the east or what have you. What does that mean? Well, you know, an early modern historian would have to go through several steps to actually figure out what that translates into. So my goal here was just to do a quick and easy tool that would help you, provide you with some answers if you were to come across that in a source. Here's an English example, which just shows you how this conversion isn't something that you could just throw at a computer, right? It requires a little bit of interpretation. Especially because it can be a bit idiosyncratic. So this one's a good example because it's all in miles, but that's frequently not the case. So I've learned about all sorts of distance measures I did not know about prior. So this is the core of what Evan and I have done, which is to create dictionaries that allow for a quick and easy conversion, so essentially ratios. What you're seeing here is that I've used the German mile as kind of the universal constant. And this is based on my work with the primary sources that I had initially started with the Italian mile because the itineraries I was working with most closely were Italian. But in doing the work, I found that the German mile was actually being referred to much more frequently as kind of the standard, which makes sense when you think about it. Not only are we talking about the Habsburg Empire in this period, which is an enormous agglomeration of territories over which certain, you know, this is especially true for the currency, they have the best ability to standardize of almost any political entity in this period, or at least create a constant to which the many members of the empire can refer. And so that's what I saw going on with the German mile, is that it's essentially an imperial mile. It also makes sense when you think about the fact that many of the territories border Germany. So if you're thinking about this in terms of conversions that a traveler is actually making on the road, going between the German system, the Italian system, the German system, the French system is much more common than, you know, for example, the English mile. And then down at the bottom, that's the addition of the modern metric system, which means that you'll be able to quickly and easily, if you read the phrase, you know, traveling 5 English miles, you won't automatically assume that it's the modern mile, which would be incorrect and lead you in a wrong direction. So to give you an example of what this might look like for a researcher, these are 2 of the conversion ratios that are provided in Codogno's itinerary book, which again is just to show that this isn't an automatic thing, especially if you're coming at this from the perspective of a student who's perhaps writing a dissertation like I was at the time, without a strong background in what exactly these individual systems are. So what the tool lets you do, and this is where we can do a live demo if you'd like, is that it lets you convert this a little more easily. And this is the interface that Evan has built in large part. You know, I did a mock-up, but he made it a reality. And it's live at the moment. Well, this is with some caveats. I'm going to go through back, and especially the currency needs some updating, but the mileage I'm actually fairly happy with at this point in time. So what you're able to do is you're able to go put in, I have 5 Hungarian posts, and I want to see what this is in modern kilometers. And again, this is mdigit.org for early modern digital itineraries. And you'll get an answer down at the bottom of the screen, which is that it's about 112.6 modern kilometers. So that's mileage, which again is relatively straightforward as these things go. Let's get into currency briefly. So in thinking about this, I kind of went back and I was curious what historians do when it comes to currency. And the answer is we tend to have a note at the beginning of a book or work that says, that's called a note on currency, so to speak. And there's a couple different approaches for this. You might, on the one hand, provide a set of ratios, as is being done on the left. It might be a narrative on the right that kind of blends the citation of other secondary sources with some key dates for when standardization or changes occur. And then on bottom, you have the system of trying to provide a sense of actual real value. In this case, indicating that 10 florins might be the equivalent to buy grain for a year. So many different ways of going about it. I think my experience in doing the dissertation, at least, was that I just went and found a secondary source that had something similar and borrowed it from there, which felt a little strange, given that I felt like I should have a deeper understanding. It also means that I think everybody goes back to Braudel for this information, which is somewhat interesting because this is, very much a pre-computational work. It's not, if you try and get a precise conversion from Braudel, it's going to be this process of trying to read a grainy graph or locate the original tables that were published in the Annals Journal, and so not user-friendly, I'd say. So similar to the mileage, I tried to work out some of what I already knew and some of what I needed to look into a little bit deeper. What was the root system for many of these currencies? So you have a system of silver currency that in many ways goes back to a Carolingian system, which is the pound, the shilling, and the penny, going by different names in different places, but essentially a ratio of the 1 to 20 to 240. This period also sees the introduction of the dollar coin, the thaler. Gets a little more complicated. Gold. So most of the currency systems in Europe in this period are bimetallic. So there's several efforts in this period to switch from really concentrating on one to the other, but in practice, most of them remain bimetallic. The gold florin had kind of first been introduced in the 13th century as a somewhat pan-European currency of exchange. This gets imitated in many different places for our purposes, most importantly, as the gulden or the guilder. This period also sees the introduction of the ducat, as we know it in English, the ducato, which originally comes from duchy, I learned, and in many ways is the Venetian coin of choice. So associated with the Doge of Venice, but then also quickly becomes copied, replicated, exchanged across Europe. The many small daily currencies are highly regional, highly idiosyncratic, made of various alloys, coppers, what have you. Then there's, of course, monies of account versus monies of exchange. So there's monies that are actually minted, and then there's imaginary monies, which may sometimes be minted, may never be minted, and largely appear only on paper. So the use of a mark, I believe, is much more commonly is not a real currency. And then in the 1550s, this is somewhat convenient for my purposes. There's a number of standardization efforts within the Holy Roman Empire, especially the Reichsmutsordnungen, which on the ground may have a more limited or gradual effect, but indicate that in theory, certain exchange rates should be set, especially between silver and gold. So I thought I'd give you some examples of what we're actually talking about here, since it's all somewhat abstract. I found the American Numismatics Society actually has a really wonderful page for finding images and really clarifying some issues about whether things actually were minted from my point of view. But these are some examples of gold coins. The ducat in particular, you start to see many different examples. The zecchino is kind of the Venetian version of that. Silver coins. So the silver coins, the gold coin issue is kind of interesting because if you're dealing with state papers, then you'll frequently see the gold coin used as the coin of exchange. And so initially for this tool, I had thought to use the Rhenish Gulden or the imperial florin as the common unit in a similar way to the German mile. What I actually found out was that these books are much more concerned with the silver currency and the silver florin. And this makes sense given that a traveler probably would not have been carrying that much gold on their person. Silver was a little more likely. Base metals is certainly the majority of what they would have spent once they were in a place, but those were much harder to exchange. Most places did not want to accept base metals that had originated in other regions. So these silver coins are really the heart of what this conversion tool works with. And they, again, you have kind of the common units, but you also have these highly regional units as well. So this ended up being a whole learning process about currency in this period, and then some of the base coins as well. So some of what I needed to do was I wanted this tool to be something that a researcher could use if they'd come across a reference in a text, but they weren't entirely sure of all the details. So for example, in the Pierre Marteau tool that I showed you, you would need to know what nationality you were dealing with, first of all. And that's not always clear in my sources when I'm working with these imperial actors who are moving between Switzerland and Italy and what have you. So they might just refer to something as a lira, and I'm on my own to guess as to what actual region it's deriving from. So one of the things I wanted to do was somewhat disambiguate some of these currency units. So essentially indicate that if you're seeing a denaro, you're basically seeing a penny in whatever place you're dealing with. I'm very open to discussion about these because this has very much been a process of trying to not read too much into the sources that isn't there, but at the same time, make them a little more user-friendly than they would just be on their own. This is what these conversions actually look like in the itineraries. So for the mileage, again, it's pretty straightforward, just prose text. They get a little creative when it comes to the currency and experimenting with tables and experimenting with these kind of odd hybrid examples that you see on the right. So this was, again, a process. Reading across the different books was actually really important for being able to understand any one book, because I think you could frequently misinterpret what you see here, especially if you're not an expert, as I was not. Again, this is what an English version of the same text looks like. Here's a great example, which is that these are two different editions of a book that was published quite widely, and I think is the basis of most of these currency conversions. And actually what's happened is that the printer has repeatedly flipped the 6 for a 9, which we see in that bottom unit. And so again, if you were looking at just one of these and not reading across the number of them, you might miss that. But once, I had seen two different editions, this was clear as an issue. Another one that I saw frequently was actually a language issue, which is that when they translated the French to the German, they misinterpreted two to mean 12. So they actually changed from a text version to a numerical version and then had a wrong number as a result. So similar to the mileage, this is a process of working out a dictionary, essentially, and using, in this case, the silver florin. So the current version of the tool that you're using, it does not take into account this difference between the silver and the gold florin, which is actually fairly key for doing the international exchange. So the next update will hopefully take care of that. But it does result in some kind of wacky numbers for international exchange at this point in time. Yeah, essentially, these are the changes that, so once I've corrected for that, this whole tool will be based on about 504 different conversion data points. So that means, this many imperial florins equals this many Venetian lira. I think 504 of those kinds of indications. It will feature 213 different currency types from 35 different locations and result in over 45,000 possible conversions, which is one of those moments where you think, well, I'm not starting with very big data, but once you kind of expand the horizon of possibilities, you end up in what feels like much more big data territory, especially for an early modernist. So I'm running a little close to time, and I do want to make sure that Evan has some time to address his part in this. Essentially, what I was going to talk about next was integrating what the next step for testing this tool is. And I'll just say briefly that I've started on this process using traveler accounts. So Fynes Morrison is this Scottish traveler in the beginning of the 17th century who keeps meticulous notes on how much he pays for things at every given place. It's kind of playing into a Scottish stereotype of frugality, I'd say. And it's a wonderful text, but it's also incredibly useful for testing this because he has a lot of very specific exchanges that he discusses. And so I've gone through and I've started to kind of test, okay, how accurate are we actually seeing exchanges here? And just a note on accuracy in general, I don't expect for this tool to be highly accurate. If you wanted that kind of highly accurate information, you really need to go into, what is the actual silver content of a given currency as it's being minted at a given time period in a given place. That's not my goal for this tool. My goal for this tool is for it to be something that approximates the kinds of rough and ready exchanges that a traveler on the road would need to make, of just judging whether they have enough for a given purchase, or whether they need to be carrying coinage, one coinage or another in a different region. So happy to discuss this further, but kind of a question I would throw out to the group is, how can I best advertise that this is really the caveat, but also the driving purpose of a tool like this? And with that, I'm actually going to turn it over to Evan, who I believe should be able to screen share from his side, but I'll go ahead and put up his slide just in case he's not.
Yeah, so I can speak from the research assistant side of things. So firstly, I can talk about, I guess, the general process of learning the skills I needed to develop the application, because actually, I'm someone with general programming experience, but I had very limited web dev experience going into this. So I had to spend the first several weeks, I'd say, just working on the project, learning the tools I needed to develop it. I ended up choosing Flask as my web framework, as I was familiar with Python previously. And so I felt that I could easily transfer my experience. And I chose Flask over Django, as from what Rachel had told me about her intentions, it seemed like it would be kind of on the smaller side. And so it wouldn't require a lot of the extra features that Django contained. I learned about Flask and the process of creating web applications simply through tutorials online to get a grounding in the material. And then when I'd become comfortable enough to make a working prototype, I just started using documentation and looking up or learning things as I went along. Rachel and I first started designing the app when we were still a little bit uncertain about various conversions, because based on the documents, as Rachel went over, there's a lot of really uncertainties about like what certain markings mean and seeming inconsistencies in data. So at first, the most important part was simply just getting everything correctly formatted and making it functional, no matter how incorrect the conversions might be. So most of the beginning stages of the project for me were just about creating the general framework and getting the basic functionality. However, most of the recent work, after kind of getting a lot of the groundwork done, is a lot about fine-tuning and updating a lot of the conversions, as well as addressing various miscellaneous bugs and creating error checking, things along that line. From the perspective of a research assistant, I found it very important to have very frequent check-ins with Rachel. So checking in with Rachel every week, or at least every other week, helped to keep me on track and make sure that I was heading in a beneficial direction. At the same time, I felt that Rachel gave me enough independence so that I could really concentrate on the work and get a lot of work done, as well as come up with my own solutions and make me feel that I played a significant role in the project. Simultaneously, I was given, the appropriate amount of feedback and assistance so that I could overcome a lot of difficulties. And I also had a very clear sense of what I should work on and what to tweak. So I found it very helpful that Rachel always had a very clear idea of what her goals for the project were, as well as suggestions about various issues that I ran into, technical or otherwise. A very important tool that helped me along the process was Trello. So my in-person meetings with Rachel were very important so that we could discuss and work out various issues, and that so I could update her on my progress. Trello, however, was very important, I felt, for giving me a very clear and organized set of tasks to accomplish. So in the end, I felt that the combination of both Trello and in-person meetings, or I guess more recently Zoom meetings, was a very helpful combo that kept everything very streamlined in the end. To me, the most difficult part of the process was, I'd say, getting steeped in a wide variety of new languages, frameworks, and technologies that I was not too familiar to begin with. As I mentioned, I was previously unfamiliar with Flask, as well as the development of web applications generally. So at first, it was definitely a somewhat difficult process. It was difficult to make a lot of significant progress, I felt, while simultaneously learning all the technology. But after like an initial learning curve, it grew much easier, and I was able to make a lot more progress in a shorter period of time. I think the most rewarding part of this whole process was the experience of building something completely from scratch. While I found it difficult at first, as I said, to adapt to all the new languages and technologies, the fact that I was able to get something working by the end gave me a great feeling of accomplishment. I found the constant collaboration with Rachel, all the discussing of ideas and implementation design, a very interesting learning process. And I learned a lot about what it's like to work with real life historical documents, as well as kind of how unwieldy they can be, and how difficult it can sometimes be to extract information from them. But also how rewarding it is to kind of create new real life working tools from this ancient data.
Thank you, Evan. And I just want to point out again that Evan really built a lot of this from scratch. I just had an idea, and he was really able to identify which direction he needed to go, teach himself many of these skills, and I think create a tool that it accomplishes my goals very well. So he really took on a big ask in many ways. Right, I think that kind of wraps up our part of it, and I'm happy to throw it to questions.
Perfect. Thank you so much, both of you, for this presentation. It's fun to learn about this tool and to think about these issues. We'll take some questions. We'll use the same system that we've used in the past. So if you will hover your cursor over the bottom margin of the window, a little menu should pop up that contains a participants icon. If you click into that icon, a menu should open probably along the side of your screen. And along the bottom of that, there should be a little blue icon that says raise hand. If you'll use that function to register your interest, I will call on people one by one, and we can see what questions we have for Rachel and Evan. Laura, reliable as ever. I am unmuting you now. Go ahead, Laura.
Great, thanks, Rachel, and thank you, Evan. This is really lovely, and I'm excited to hear the tool's actually up and usable. So I'm looking forward to playing around with it. A couple of kind of general points. Actually, Rachel, it seems to me that in creating this tool, you've done a sort of set of research into conversions in the early modern world that is sort of academically useful. And I would like to see an article come out of this. So that's just kind of an exciting challenge for you, maybe. But actually, the thing I really wanted to focus in on is the problem of change. So we've got a whole century here, and you've kind of set it up. I know there's no date slider, and I wondered how stable are these conversion rates? Do we have, I mean, there's this 1550 moment, which is an attempt to stabilize, right, with the Reichsmünzordnung, that might have shifted things a bit. And so that kind of opens a space for the question of like, how reliable is the data? Is there a point at which it's most reliable and other points where it's less reliable? I wonder if you could talk a little bit about that. Thanks.
Yeah, thank you for that. Yes, so similar to the postal routes, this data is getting published in, and I think Midora and Turcotte's book, the one that I showed with the typo issue, is the one that many other itinerary publishers are looking at. So similar to the routes, they're republishing a lot of the same information across this entire period. with working with the postal routes, I use this as somewhat a measure of accuracy, basically making the assumption that if this was highly inaccurate information, it wouldn't be going to press anew, even given the convenience of being able to more or less plagiarize an existing work. That same assumption holds true here, that if a given rate was really considered unusable, that it probably wouldn't be appearing in these later editions. And so if I did, while working with this, find that I had 2 or 3 different ratios, generally they were still reasonably close. And so I did, in some cases, just average and use that. And I should probably indicate that a little more clearly on the tool as well. But yes, we had talked about doing a date. Ultimately, I just thought it wasn't going to be doable within the time that I wanted to devote to this project, and that I still may just come down on the side of saying, look, this tool represents the information that would have been available to a traveler at this given time, with all of the caveats of potential inaccuracies that that traveler would have encountered as well.
All right, Giovanna, you have a question? Go ahead and unmute yourself when you're ready.
Thank you, Rachel. Thank you, Evan. This is so wonderful to see, and that it's already working, and to hear you both talking about the process. That's really just uplifting. I have a question, because I have in my mind, Rachel, also the maps that are much more geographical, that have come from your work on this set of materials. And I remember that when I looked at those maps from past presentations, and knowing, it's interesting how it is in the map and the frequency and the various towns involved in the itineraries, you get a sense also, and sometimes I think it has changed through time, also of political development tied to the geography. And so my question is of 2 sides in that, when you say this is what is available to a traveler in their own time, and I like, and this is a little bit of a Rachel question, because it's a question that you often pose to others. It's like, what does it mean on the ground? Or what would it mean for the actors at the time? And so I wonder, because when I heard you talking about this material before, it's primarily for the traveling postmasters, and then it becomes about the travelers more widespreadly as there is an increase of traveling. But I now wonder, I never thought about this before, like when we move across boundaries, we usually have to leave a currency behind in your exchange. Well, am I understanding right that in this case, I don't know how this works, it's come from total ignorance, and so instead you don't leave behind. I mean, I wonder what happens to the actual objects, and if they circulate beyond the travelers, because if you are the conversion doesn't happen at the airport, I imagine, or at the bank. So you bring it into the local actors, and then what does that signify in this way? It seems, I think you can do better. It's just than I'm trying to do with these questions. But
well, that's exactly the place where I started from, which is that I was thinking about what actually happens on the ground. And that's where reading the traveler accounts in addition to the itinerary books can be quite useful. And the itinerary books do, in addition to this more slightly tabular data I've been showing you, have a great deal of prose, providing guidance for travelers about the nature of things like exchanging currency and crossing boundaries especially. This is a great quote from the Fines Morrison account that I've been talking about, though, where he's discussing exactly this difficulty, right? Where there's no such thing as universal legal tender at this point in time. Any given merchant can decide not to accept any given coin, and they do. And so that's why silver coins, and particularly coins like the imperial dollar, which are minted under greater regulation, are more widely accepted, because the merchants can be sure that they haven't been debased, that they aren't a forged currency. And so, and there's a lot of discussion about the jealousy of trade in this period, and that's something that I've been reading up on, this idea of it's actually illegal in many places to take silver and gold out of the territory in whatever form. And so there's issues with merchants who make their business off of essentially taking coinage from one country and moving it to another where it's worth more for whatever reason. And so that's being actively prosecuted in this period. So it's fascinating to see that nonetheless, these books are still very much providing guidance with exactly how an individual might carry this currency on their person. My impression so far is that in Fynes Morrison's case, that he's either making use of a budding system of paper money, which is again coming into being at this point in time, or he's carrying silver on his person. And that also becomes clear when I see the attacks on couriers that are occurring in this period, because they'll often indicate exactly how much money was stolen as a part of the attack. So I think it's a combination of these things. He's very aware of this exchange value because, of course, a bill of exchange indicates exactly, you know, that if you're originally depositing this money in silver sovereigns in London, the amount that you get upon arrival in Genoa is entirely dependent on that exchange rate. So the traveler might be going into it with one set of expectations. The reality might be slightly different. And that's something that Fynes will comment on specifically every time that happens. Does that answer the question?
Yes, yes.
Good.
And then if there is more time at the end, I have more questions. No, but this is
Sure.
such a fascinating way into this material that you're creating and opening new questions clearly as well. But I have another one, but I keep it for later. I want to leave other people.
All right, Paula, I see you. I'm unmuting you now. Go ahead.
Great. Well, Rachel and Evan, thank you for this, wonderful presentation. I mean, I think this is already, a very useful tool as it is. And of course, it is the kind of tool that then, inspires thinking about, what the next steps might be. So I wanted to add to the questions in that vein. And I am wondering if one of the possibilities, and this would be a discussion to have with some of the economic historians who thought about these things, who are very familiar with merchant manuals like Francesca Tribolato, or maybe even talking with Luca Ferro, who works on an earlier period, or Luca Mola, right? And others, we can think of who don't work on Italy, because of course I know those best. But I am wondering, would it be interesting going forward to identify, maybe one or two merchant manuals that are specifically for the traveling merchants for these same periods, right?
Yeah.
And again, you can't bring all of these possible sources in. So I love the way you're bringing in Fynes Morrison as a strategic traveler who provides us with an interesting test case relationship. So I think that idea, like, do you want to have certain test cases of travel itineraries, starting with this one, but also certain test cases of what's happening to the merchant manual or handbook, in the same period. Because I find myself thinking, what actually is so wonderful about your tool is it's, for those of us who've read, the account books, of the late Middle Ages, into the early modern period. I mean, these practice manuals, right, of commercial arithmetic, where people say over and over again, make me this calculation. And what they're doing is mental practice, right? They're providing a pedagogy, of commercial arithmetic that initially is handwritten, so we find it literally in people's account books or family papers, right? A made book for practicing mental calculation that you're now automating and digitizing. But then those very techniques, of course, then go into the printed works of commercial arithmetic. And then ultimately, in some sense, in a different way, into merchant manuals. So maybe that's the other source also I have in mind is, certain kinds of really influential manuals of commercial arithmetic could have, you wouldn't want to take all the problems, but they could have certain kinds of problems that are exactly your problem as well.
Yeah, thank you, Paula. Yeah, I think you're exactly right. And I think what I would find is it's probably exactly the same conversion rates being published in many places. I think there's a lot, just based on my work with looking into the itinerary authors, looking into where they're getting their other information. So another common inclusion will be a list of where all the fairs are being held. I'm sure that is absolutely just taken from the kinds of mercantile ephemeral literature that's being printed by the same publishers in the same period in the same places. But it would be certainly worth checking, and it may provide me with additional test cases, essentially to evaluate the relative accuracy of these books.
Yeah, no, that's a great idea about the fairs too. I actually, one of the people who's thought about the fairs, though it's been a while, is Corey Tetzera down at Scripps. There was a period he was working on some of these Genoese manuals, and he never published on it, but he probably still remembers a fair amount about that kind of material. But yeah, like the fair in Besançon, as well as Frankfurt. I mean, there are certain ones that are very famous. Anyway, thank you for that, and again, thanks to you, and my compliments to you and Evan for a wonderful presentation on the tools that you're. I really look forward to using them.
Thank you.
Alrighty, I actually have a question. So you have helped solve a mystery for me today, going back to my earliest encounter with ancient Greek, where in Xenophon's Anabasis, there are 2 units of time and space that are used, parasangs and stathmoi. Stathmoi are sometimes translated as posting stations. And so this is like an interesting retrojection, a way of analogizing this. And parasangs have the sort of distance component to them. And so I'm interested in what the collocation of those 2 gets. So in Xenophon, based on the ratio of parasangs and stathmoi, you get a sort of impressionistic sense of how difficult it is to travel because everyone is sort of marching along at this. And so I'm intrigued by whether you can read in between the lines of some of these, since these are sort of traveling manuals to try to understand the difficulty of travel, whether there are other sorts of collocations that are helpful or interesting, or maybe less interesting in this case, in your particular case, and more interesting in mine when you're trying to get out of Asia Minor under Tibet.
Yeah, no, I mean, I keep going back to Orbis as an example that I'm thinking with. I always am. But that kind of information is exactly something that kind of led me down this path because, of course, the original database is of these routes and indicates how many posts are located along a given route, but also at what locations. And certainly the courier is regarded as a measure of difficulty, how common the postal way stations are versus how long a distance you might go before encountering another one. I think actually that's interesting to hear about the staphnoid because one of the weirder measurements that I didn't end up including, but I'd like to go back and do at some point is a stage, which I think is directly related. It's sometimes written STADJ, it's sometimes STAGE, and it's definitely related to an older system of way stations that I think is sometimes read onto the postal way stations that are being created, but not always. One of the other weird things that comes about is that the French system is one of the hardest to reconcile into a tool like this. So actually I even have an old French mile and a new French mile because that's the language that these itinerary writers are using. And even then, I'm not sure it's actually quite getting the diversity of miles that they're encountering. But similarly, a postal mile actually comes into being I think by the 1660s, so just at the end of the period I'm covering. But it's basically a mile that's been standardized to be usable for the postal way stations.
Interesting. Yeah, I mean, it's worth checking into because stathmoi are sometimes converted into like Olympic stades. So there is theoretically, you could do the sort of conversion with a stathmos,
right,
with these stade measurements. So thanks very much.
Thank you.
Are there other questions for Rachel and Evan before we adjourn? Going once, going twice? Thanks very much for a wonderful online series this term and for joining us on this digital adventure. I'm really grateful, I think, on behalf of Giovanna and Amanda and everyone at CESTA and all of our wonderful presenters. Thank you, thank you. Have a good afternoon.